Hello, guten Morgen, konnichiwa. Welcome to our coffee talk on biodiversity. When we hear about biodiversity in the news, it is often in alarming context. The number of insects is declining at an unprecedented pace, ecosystems are collapsing, and some scientists point out we are now in the middle of a mass extinction which could threaten humankind itself. While we know biodiversity loss is a crisis we must tackle urgently, we seldom take time to look at what biodiversity actually means and, in fact, how little we know about it. For example, no one knows how many species are living on Earth right now. Estimates range from 2 million to 1 trillion species, which is a huge scale, and only a fraction of these species has been described so far. Many species are too small to find without technological help or live in inaccessible territories like the deep sea. And even if we are talking about database species, we need huge amounts of information to describe, let alone predict their movements and the consequences of species loss. How can recent advances in science and technology help us find the missing information in order to tackle biodiversity loss? And how can research findings be translated into political actions? These are the questions we would like to discuss in today's event. My name is Laura Bleken. I'm Program Manager of DWIH Tokyo, and it is my great pleasure to chair today's discussion. I'm very honored to have three distinguished speakers with me today. Please let me introduce Professor Tomohiro Ichinose, Dean of Faculty of Environment and Information Studies at Keio University. He's a renowned expert on birds diversity as well as on landscape ecology, environmental sciences, and rural planning. During his PhD on the relationship between bird distribution and environmental factors, he visited the Technical University of Munich for research. Currently, he is involved in projects at the Aso grassland landscape and Satoyama Hills in Japan. Tomohiro, thank you so much for being with us today. Next, I would like to introduce Professor Julia Siegwart, Head of Malacology at the Senckenberg Research Institute and Natural History Museum in Frankfurt. She is an expert for the evolution of mollusks and has discovered several new species, many living in the deep sea. In a Japanese-German collaboration, she has investigated the so-called scaly foot snail, now listed as endangered on the IUCN Red List. Julia, thank you so much for joining today. We are looking forward to hearing more about that snail. And now, last but not least, I would like to introduce Professor Stefan Hotes, professor at the Applied Landscape Ecology Lab at Chuo University in Tokyo. He is an expert for the ecology of cultural landscapes, sustainable land management, and the interface of science and policy making. Before coming to Chuo University, he was working at the University of Marburg. He has a long history of researching in Japan, including his PhD research in the wetlands of Hokkaido and work as assistant professor at the University of Tokyo. Stefan, thank you so much for joining the discussion. And also thank you for taking the initiative to bring up the topic of biodiversity to the Coffee Talk series. I know we had it on our list for a while now, and I'm very happy we found today the occasion to tackle this topic with such a great group of speakers. Now, just before we begin, please let me make some logistic remarks for our viewers. As always, we have a Japanese translation of this talk available. You can also listen to this talk on Japanese. In order to do that, please use the separate YouTube link, which was sent to you in your registration email. And we are very curious to hear about your thoughts on today's topic and about your questions. And in order to let us know about them, please use the link to a website called Slido. You can find the link on the DWIH website as well as in the registration email, which was sent to you. And yeah, please don't hesitate to let us know about all your questions. We will try to take them up in the discussion as well. Right now, to set the stage for the discussion, first I would like to ask all of our speakers to introduce briefly one project of their research which aims to foster biodiversity, just that we get an overview of what is actually going on right now. Julia, maybe we can start with you.
Thank you. So as you mentioned in the introduction, one of the projects that I've been involved with for the last several years is actually working in collaboration with the IUCN Red List for Endangered Species. And this is a species-based conservation tool, but one of the most famous in the world, because everybody knows when you say a species is endangered, this is clear. It has some meaning, not just to scientists, but to everyone. And
Right.
one of the questions that my colleagues at Jamstack and I brought up was, how can we communicate the potential risks to deep sea species? Because landscapes like my colleagues here can talk about with birds and with landscapes, these are the things that we see every day. And so the value to us is clear, but the deep sea is out of sight and out of mind. And so we thought that actually making formal scientific assessments of the extinction risk for deep sea species is a way to explain to everyone how vulnerable these habitats really are. And the first one, and perhaps the most famous, is this snail. I'm sharing the screen now. So you can see this extraordinary animal that we've done a lot of work on called the scalyfoot snail. And it's a small animal, only about 5 centimeters long, but it has these iron-infused scales all over the soft foot of the snail. And this was the first ever animal that was added to the global red list of threatened species as endangered by the threat of deep sea mining.
Yes, thank you very much. That's a very impressive video. I think I'm not sure actually where all the body parts are of that snail right now, but maybe we can come back to that topic later, because I think this is also very important if we look at how the research findings can actually be translated into political actions. So maybe, yeah, let's come back to that later. Thank you very much, Julia, for that insight into your research. Next, may I ask Stefan to share one of his recent projects of research?
Thank you. Yes, I would like to mention some of the work that I've been doing on wetlands in Japan. And this is, well, as Julia pointed out, those are more or less visible when you are standing next to them. And you can actually stand next to them. And sometimes you can also go into them. And these wetlands are in many ways interlinked with our existence, that the water cycle basically creates these areas. And yeah, that I would like to also maybe share my first slide, because that shows one of the places in Hokkaido where I have done work during my PhD. So these wetlands mostly are pretty flat on the surface, but small changes in the surface can mean big differences for the animals and plants that live in them. And they, in many cases, store a lot of carbon, but they can also be sources of greenhouse gases like methane, for example. And so the role of wetlands in the overall global cycles of matter and the flows of energy are still a big issue for research. And the animals and plants living in them are often very special, have very special, very narrow habitat requirements. And so many of these are also endangered because we keep changing wetlands. And where we are now, where I am, you are, Laura, in Tokyo, much of the area of Tokyo is former wetland. And so that is something that you probably, most people wouldn't really think about when they go through Tokyo. But yeah, so we have changed many wetlands very, very dramatically. And yeah, we need to figure out in more detail what we can do also to restore these areas where they have been lost. And even in downtown Tokyo, there are some small patches now where people try to reestablish wetlands along the bigger rivers, for example. And yeah, so there are lots of fascinating things where also local communities and these ecosystems interact.
Yes, great, thank you. I think we already have so much to talk about, but may I ask you to unshare your slide, right? Just looking at the focus of your research, so Julia just mentioned the species, you say you're more looking on the landscape of the wetlands. I think this is a topic we will also come back to, how we actually look at biodiversity on which level. But before we address that, Tomohiro, may I ask you also for one example of your research projects?
Yeah, thank you very much for your introduction. And so, as you introduced me at the beginning, then I recently conducted a project in Aso region, located in the central part of Kyushu. Then I want to share just one slide at first. Then you can see here, this is Aso landscape. You can see very nice grassland.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And it's one of the oldest national park and famous for the grassland landscape in Japan. The area of grassland in the Aso region is about 22,000 hectares. There is a much precipitation in Japan, so our climax vegetation should become a forest. But in history, people had maintained the grassland for agriculture. For example, natural fertilizer, livestock, firewood, and so on. Now, 150 years ago, 10% of land in Japan was grassland, but the ratio decreased to just 1%. The Aso region has the largest semi-natural grassland and rich biodiversity, but the area decreases due to depopulation, farmers aging, and management abandonment. Okay, thank you very much.
Right, yes, thank you so much. So I think we can already see that we have a lot of areas covered today, ranging from the deep sea to wetlands and grasslands. So maybe now I can come back to the question of how we actually look at biodiversity. As we saw, right, the research of Stefan and Tomohiro seems to concentrate more on the landscape scale of analyzing biodiversity. Stefan, maybe can you explain to us what biodiversity actually means?
I will give it a go, and I will bring up the slide again. First here, a statement from the former head of the United Nations Environment Program, who said that conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity is still very difficult to communicate, and it's not well understood. And part of that may be due to the fact that there are so many levels at which we can look at biodiversity, because if you just take the word for itself, the diversity of life, implying that we can look at anything that is influenced by living beings. And so that can be done at molecular level, because many molecules are only synthesized in living organisms. And then you have genes, and you have species and ecosystems. And the red ones in here, in the genes, the species and the ecosystems, are indeed what is also being used by the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity to talk about what biodiversity is and what it means to us humans.
Right. So is my understanding right that in your research you would actually interpret biodiversity as an ecosystem and not focus so much on the species and genes, whereas if you're actually looking to find new species to put on the red list, maybe the research focus is more on the other definition of biodiversity?
Well, you can look at it as kind of, it's a hierarchical system, or it's nested, you could say, that in each individual there are obviously molecules and genes, and each individual is part of a population and so on. And so whenever you look at a higher level or larger scale aspect of biodiversity, all the other ones, all the other levels that are smaller scale or more detailed, are necessarily part of it. And but yeah, what also is kind of challenging for the research is what we sometimes talk about in science more in general, not just in ecology, about emergent properties. That we have to, we cannot explain a system just by knowing its component parts, but that the way that these parts interact brings about new aspects, new qualities that are often very important. And so that, I guess, is one of the additional challenges.
Okay, I see. Yeah, thank you very much. May I ask you again to unshare the slide? That would be wonderful. And yes, when we talked about the topic of biodiversity, I also heard that Tomohiro and Stefan, you're obviously doing research in Japan right now, and that the concept of Satoyama is a very important concept when it comes to biodiversity as well. Satoyama is a Japanese word consisting of the letters for village and hill, and maybe Tomohiro, may I ask you to explain to us how this concept is actually influencing the Japanese stance towards biodiversity and how research is conducted?
Okay, then I want to share screen again. Yeah. So the next one, oops. Yeah, then so actually Satoyama, so combined by two words, Sato and Yama. Then originally Sato means a village, then Yama is a mountain, but also it also means a forest. And Satoyama means a traditional rural landscape, then mainly maintained by agriculture. Recently, the word Satoumi means a coastal area managed by fisheries. The Satoyama is one of the secondary nature and maintained by agriculture. The landscape comprises rice paddies, irrigation ponds, canal, paddy levees, and coppice forest. Then it has been held for over 1,000 years in Japan and has kept typical biodiversity. I show one example. The rice fish, Oryzus, is a typical fish in the Satoyama landscape. The life cycle adapts to rice cultivation by humans. In spring, they move into rice paddy, which are shallow water. The water temperature becomes warmer with sunshine, and there are no bigger fishes. The condition is good for the spawning and growth of rice fish. Before harvesting, farmers drain water from rice paddies, so grown fishes move into canals again. And I showed just one example here, but there are many species adapting agriculture and the maintenance of the landscape. So we can find a rich biodiversity in Satoyama.
Yes, I see. So it is yeah, very much about the kind of nature which is influenced already by humans, but where nature and especially the agricultural land is still playing a very important role. Stefan, from your experience in Germany, I think agriculture is also very important in Germany. Is there a similar concept which we are underlying when we are starting to talk about biodiversity in these areas?
Yes, well, we have the term Kulturlandschaft in German, which is always also a bit tricky to use in conversations when you have people from very different backgrounds. To ecologists, a cultural landscape basically is Satoyama. So there you have pretty much the same idea, that it is an area that has been used by humans in a particular way in order to produce food, in order to produce, for example, fuel like firewood, often in a particular way over centuries. And that this type of land use has created particular patterns, and that many animal and plant species, fungi, microorganisms also have adapted to existing in these landscapes where humans conduct certain activities in a regular way. And these tend to be pretty species rich. And yeah, so they are these landscapes, these Satoyama landscapes or Kulturlandschaften, cultural landscapes are much of the focus of conservation activities. Mm-hmm. So although we say nature conservation, it is strictly speaking not untouched wild nature, but rather nature that has been altered by human impact.
I see. Yeah, thank you. That brings us actually right to the question of today's event. So I think we really have to look at how we can use recent science and technologies to help to gather information about the loss of biodiversity. And before we look at concrete examples of recent technology, maybe we can just summarize what are the main risks right now in your areas of research posed to biodiversity, that we have the setting in which we can locate then how the research can actually help to tackle these challenges. And Julia, we will come back to the back sea. I'm sorry we're taking some time on the land now, but as we have just talked about Satoyama and Kulturlandschaften, Tomohiro, may I ask you what are the major risks in these landscapes right now for biodiversity?
Okay, then yeah, so actually the Japanese government indicate the 4 drivers of the biodiversity loss in Japan. So development pressure, reduce human activities, that is related to Satoyama, then invasion species and global warming. Then, yeah, I want to explain the situation related to the rice fish. I showed already the one example. The modernization of rice cultivation impact the life cycle of rice fish. And farmers have to control water level precisely for the quality of rice. So canals have been separated for irrigation and drain. And water is culvert drained from the paddy fields. Then it means that the rice fish cannot move between the paddy field and the canals. Also, the abandonment of rice cultivation so lose its habitat.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I see. Thank you very much. So that is one of the points which would be critical to the rice fish. And is there anything what we have learned through recent technology advances in this complex interaction between the humans and the environment? Is there any points where recent research has actually helped to shed light on these issues?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that should be a little difficult. And then can I explain also about the example about the Aso region, then maintain the grassland landscape? Then yeah, I want to share my screen. Yeah. So that is the situation in the Aso region. So as I told you, the semi-natural grassland maintained by agriculture, so that keeps a rich biodiversity. Now there are many endangered species remaining there. The traditional ways have maintained the grassland, like this slide, then for more than 1,000 years in Aso region. Its long history has also nurtured variety of cultures. So the burning spring is quite essential to maintain the grassland, but it should be dangerous, and local people have to create long fire break during summer to prevent the spread of fire to forest. the length of the fire break is more than 500 kilometers within the Aso region, then which is from the Tokyo to Osaka. Then, and hunting fire during burning then requires a high level of skill and responsibility. Then in event of an accident, the leader can be held criminally liable. Then so it becomes so more difficult to continue managing the grassland. The grassland are either planted and become timber forest, or management is abandoned so that the vegetation succession can proceed. Then the grassland biodiversity we lose. Then that is a big problem in Aso region.
Yes, I think, thank you very much also for the visuals. I think that helps a lot. We've actually now received a question from the audience at this point, which I think could give a good impulse also for our further discussion. So one of our viewers is asking, why is biodiversity valuable? Yeah, which is a broad question. Maybe Stefan, can I direct that at you? Could you answer to that? Why is biodiversity valuable?
Thank you. Yeah, that is one of the big questions. And again, one that is not easy to communicate, as like mentioned on the first slide. There are different aspects. We can look at biodiversity as something that we can use for something. We can look at it as something that regulates important processes in our environment. And we can look at biodiversity as something that is of cultural value. And so that relates also to the term ecosystem service that is becoming used more and more commonly in many areas, and also in the context of planning and policy making, where it is an attempt to somehow quantify what biodiversity means to us as humans. And obviously there are a limited number of species that we use directly as food, as feed for our livestock, as resources that we can build something out of, or something like that. That is clearly a very limited number of species compared to the amazing diversity that is out there. And so to somebody who only looks at what he or she can use, that person might say, well, I can forget about the rest, but just if as long as I have this species that I can use directly, I'm happy. But well, what ecologists have been trying to point out is that we rely on ecosystems in a much more complex manner, and that the way that fluxes of energy or cycles of matter function, that is linked to diversity at a higher level. And we have some insights into that through recent research. But I would say that we are still quite far from having a complete understanding. And yeah, that their science is indeed one of the ways that we can try to figure out more, to learn more about these different aspects and values. To me personally, the cultural aspect. So I'm just happy if there are different species that I can look at. So, but that's something that is sometimes difficult to communicate. If somebody says, oh, that doesn't mean anything to me, then I don't really have any convincing way of saying, but you should look at the world like I do.
Right, so, right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would also be interested, Julia, in your point of view, especially your insights on the deep sea biodiversity, which maybe to many of us, not the thing we are, looking at every day. So why is that valuable?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that these are difficult questions to answer because most people's experience of biodiversity is limited to a few things that we see around us, like if you're living in a very urban landscape, you see other humans, we're one species, you maybe see birds or maybe some insects, but usually the insects are not so nice. And it's hard to remember that these are part of larger systems that are beneficial to the entire planet and that actually link together to the functioning of the entire biosphere. So I think the best way to answer these questions is really to focus on the very clear scientific evidence that's been developed over many, many decades now, that more diverse ecosystems are more resilient. And as we know that all of these things connect in terms of the water cycle that brings us fresh water, to our food, to the pollinators that deliver even crop plants that we depend on, to the fish that live in the rice paddies, more species allow these systems, whether it's a modified landscape or a natural ecosystem, more species, more diversity within these landscapes makes them more resilient to disruption, more resistant to change, more able to withstand both the natural ups and downs and also the accelerated change that we have with climate change. And so it's in all of our interest in all ecosystems to protect as much diversity as possible, whether we can immediately recognize all of those components or not.
Right, thank you very much for pointing out the major factor of resilience, which I think is, yeah, every one of us can understand that right now this is a very, very important reason to protect biodiversity. Maybe we can now look into the deep sea a bit more. So could you tell us about the risks of biodiversity at the deep sea? What do we even know about how many species are there and what is happening down there?
Well, this is a good point you mentioned in your introduction, that one of the great questions in biodiversity is how many species are there on Earth? And, you know, to a certain extent, this feels like a very old-fashioned question, you know, like, shouldn't we know the answer by now? But in fact, the more technology that we have, the more apparent it is that there's more and more diversity that we never dreamed about. As we're more able to explore different parts of the planet and we're able to recognize the species that we find. And the terrifying thing is that a lot of these species are being driven to extinction or removed from habitats before they're even discovered. And in the marine realm, especially because we are terrestrial animals, we cannot naturally go into the ocean environment ourselves. It's more difficult for us to explore. And as we study the oceans, both the coastal ecosystems and the deep sea, it's clear that possibly 90% of the species in the oceans in total have never been described or named. And, you know, so there's a lot of work to be done to understand what lives in the oceans in the first instance, so that we can understand what needs to be protected and what this means. A colleague of mine here at Senckenberg has been doing a lot of work on effectively understanding landscapes in the deep sea. There's this historical idea that the deep sea is an empty desert, an abyss, that nothing lives there. But this is simply not true. The whole planet, including the deep sea, is full of life. And the deep sea is also composed of landscapes and different habitats at the same scale as we see on land, just ones that are not easy for us to visit or map or see. And so one of the great threats right now that we're worried about is the increasing technology and the increasing drive for deep sea mining, which is an example of direct destruction of marine habitats. But to be fair, there are many other ways that we're concerned about the destruction of deep sea biodiversity, including the impacts of fishing, so direct extraction. But also it's clear that there's an interaction between the land and the sea, that, you know, for example, agricultural runoff from land impacts the estuaries and the coastal environments. And increasingly, we can see that this has been happening already for hundreds of years. And of course, as there are more and more people, there's more and more impact. And so I think understanding the marine biodiversity and the species that make up marine biodiversity can help us to understand those impacts and to focus protection on particular landscapes that will benefit most from some interventions to protect them from particular threats.
Yes, thank you very much. Maybe we can just that we get a clearer image of how we can actually, or how your research is actually contributing to gather information about the biodiversity in the deep sea. Could you tell us what you are actually doing? I mean, I imagine you're going in a submersive with Jamstack, and then you're going down to the deep sea, and then you're looking for species, or what is actually the main part of your research? And maybe you could also touch on how technology is playing a part in that and the recent advancements.
Yeah, sure. Well, one of the great ways that we have to explore the deep sea is increasingly using some pretty amazing technologies. And Jamstack is a great leader in developing these technologies, both in terms of robotics. So we might use autonomous underwater vehicles, which are kinds of robots that can sample the water or even collect planktonic animals from the water and understand a bit more about the distribution of life and water chemistry in the open ocean, down to having a human occupied vehicle or a submersible that people actually get into. So I had the privilege of getting to do this once, but the Japanese submersible, the Shinkai 6500, is probably the best known and the most technologically advanced submersible in the world, that can take 3 people down to the sea floor to actually observe. You know, you're actually looking through a window directly onto the deep sea at 3 kilometers or more down below the surface, to look and explore, and then to selectively take samples and bring them back to the surface for analysis in the lab. But we collect samples using many different technologies in many different ways. And then there is a long process of working on these materials that passes through many hands, many collaborators, and involves a lot of additional analysis back on land, more than just the 3 people who go down to see the deep sea at any one day.
Yes, I see, but I think that must be an experience everyone wants to have, probably, if you are researching that field. Yes,
Indeed.
Thank you very much. About the topic of technologies, maybe Tomohiro, may I also direct this question at you? I think you have also much experience with monitoring birds' movements and maybe in the areas of drones or so on. Could you tell us what are recent technologies that are employed actually in your research on biodiversity?
Okay, then actually, I think the monitoring of biota is a very important and a first step in biodiversity conservation. Then I want to show one short video. Yeah. Then now I have some project to monitor natural conditions using drones. And I show in the video taken using the infrared sensor from a drone. And maybe, you can find a small dot moving.
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah, this is a wild boar. Then moving at night. Then actually wild boar are difficult to observe because they are active at night. Then their movement capacities, capability were not well known, but so we use a drone to calculate their average migration speed. Then, and also the next one, that is waterfalls. Then also this is at night. Then using a drone, then we are trying to identify species and automatically count the number of individuals using machine learning.
I see. Is this a research at Keio University right now, or is it an international project? No, it's from your
that is it.
lab.
Yeah, and actually I showed this pond then in our campus. Actually, my students try to catch the waterfall at night.
I see. Thank you. Stefan, maybe could you add to that? How do you employ recent technology in your research?
Yeah, thank you. That there are lots of things that are going on, obviously, with sensing. So what Tomohiro just showed, that we have increasingly the possibility to look at the world from above, and at day and at night, and like that, capture images of organisms that are large enough to be actually displayed. And yeah, so that is something, and obviously even at still larger scales, Earth observation from space is also one of the key elements that helps us understand how the whole biosphere works. And at the other end, there is also increasingly the use of molecular methods, where environmental DNA, for example, is one of the keywords that's, or one of the techniques that many people are now trying to use. And there are different habitats that are more or less, where this technique is more or less applicable. And usually wetland environments or aquatic environments where you have water that you can sample and then actually can extract DNA from the water, that there it's quite successful already. But there are also attempts at developing sampling stations that are more or less automatically monitoring what is there. Also on land, for example, where air is sucked into a sampling device, and then the kind of residue that collects in the filter can then also be analyzed using DNA analysis techniques. And so those are things that are under development.
Okay, great, thank you. Actually, we have received a question from the audience about artificial intelligence. And we were asked how artificial intelligence can help to protect biodiversity, and where the strengths are in Japan and Germany in this area. Is this something, Stefan, I could also ask you about? Do you have, are you using artificial intelligence in your projects?
I personally have not used it so far, but we are slowly preparing for that. But yeah, there are lots of people who are much more advanced than me personally in applying these methods. But yeah, there are obviously with more information becoming available in digital formats, that there's more opportunity for screening this kind of information for patterns, for similarities, and that can be both at molecular level, it can be about genetic information, but also about species recognition. What Tomohiro mentioned with the simple question, how many organisms are within the sight of my camera right now? That is something that you can try to solve using algorithms that are coming from the artificial intelligence development.
Yeah, thank you. As you know, at DWIH Tokyo, artificial intelligence is also a very important topic because it is also a major point of German-Japanese collaboration, and we are planning our trilateral symposium on artificial intelligence in October. And actually, we will also have a dedicated session to AI and biodiversity. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about that, because I think it's a very promising field. And we also see that from recent strategies at the from the German government, which also, yes, seems to look at this field. So now we have looked at many examples of how technology is used and how the recent advancements are actually helping us to find better information. But would you say these advancements are actually game changers for the question of biodiversity conservation? Is it the research that is missing, or is it something else? Julia, maybe you have an opinion on that.
I think that, in a marine context, we've seen technological advances over the last 10 or 20 years that have really radically changed our ability to access ocean habitats in the deep sea. And a lot of this is coming together actually now. This year starts the UN Decade for Ocean Science, for a Sustainable Ocean. And part of this UN Decade is not only trying to capitalize on these recent technological advancements, but also the fact that this is a global problem. The oceans do not belong to one nation or a few nations, or even only to nations with a coastline. The oceans are part of the planet that impact everyone. And the next steps, I think, are not just the technology that gives us access to reach the deep sea and to better image and monitor and understand the deep sea, but to open that to people from all around the world, and not only to a few countries like Japan and Germany that are really the leaders in having this research infrastructure and developing these technologies. We need to make sure that it includes everybody.
Thank you. So yes, I think we have learned that technologies play a huge role, because what we cannot see, we cannot actually talk about as humans. So thank you very much for that. Tomohiro, what would you say? How important is the role of recent technologies in your area? Does it really help to protect biodiversity? And if so, in what way?
Yeah, and actually I belong to the Faculty of Environment and Information Studies. And it means so we have many IT specialists in our faculty. And actually, I just start a collaboration with other such a field. But yeah, I have some idea, as I told already, to monitor biodiversity using drone or such a technique. Then, for example, IC tag or also AI. Then I have no project related to AI. But maybe later I want to try to AI. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. And do you think these research findings, or could you explain to us how these research findings can actually be translated into political action? So you have you showed us the videos of the Boer movement, for example. What do you actually do with this research finding, and how can it actually be used to protect biodiversity on a political level?
Naya, that is a little difficult question, I think. Yeah, and yeah, actually, I want to explain from the different aspect. Actually, that I believe it is essential for the local people to understand the importance of biodiversity. Then, since the Tohoku disaster in 2011, then I also have a focus on the ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction. The natural ecosystem can mitigate damage from the natural disaster. Then sometimes it is difficult for local people to understand how biodiversity is essential, but disaster prevention is critical for local people, especially in Japan. So I explain ecosystem services, including the disaster prevention related to biodiversity. Then if local people are convinced, then they can push policymakers, I think.
I see. Yeah. Okay. That's a very practical way. Thank you very much for that. We have a question from the audience focusing on the term green infrastructure, which seems to be very popular recently in Japan as well. And a viewer is asking, how can this term contribute to enrich biodiversity? I think this green infrastructure probably is not directed at the deep sea. So maybe Stefan and Tomohiro, may I ask you about your opinion for that? Stefan, can we start with you?
Yeah, thank you. The green infrastructure relates to the term that was just used by Tomohiro with this ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction. And it is, well, the idea that we do not use concrete and steel only, but that we use areas that have vegetation in some way possibly, and therefore look green, and, but that they have an important role in, for example, regulating water flows. And that can contribute to mitigate floods, it can prevent disasters indeed, but you need space for that. It's usually kind of a space issue, and that therefore land use planners, landowners are not necessarily happy when they're being told, oh, you should use more area in order to regulate water flows, for example. And so it is indeed a societal debate, a political debate, and there are financial aspects to it that always come into play in these discussions. But yes, especially in Japan, where currently we have a declining human population, that there may be related to that some opportunities for using green infrastructure in ways that have not been used so far, and that therefore, yeah, you could use areas in order to mitigate disasters, to prevent disasters, and have them also managed in a way that a lot of organisms can live there together, so that you have a lot of biodiversity there as well. So yes, there are good opportunities for having a win-win situation.
Okay, thank you very much. Tomohiro, do you agree, or would you like to add something?
Yeah, I agree with Stefan. And yeah, as I told already, so ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction is one of the type of green infrastructure. And actually, yeah, green infrastructure is a new word, but actually it's not so new, I think. But yeah, green infrastructure is the infrastructure combined with so natural environment or ecosystems. And maybe the natural ecosystem can supply the ecosystem service for us. Then we need so green infrastructure, especially in urban area, for the ecosystem services.
Yes, I see. Thank you very much for elaborating on that as well. Now we have another question directed at you, Tomohiro. Maybe I can just read it out. How is biodiversity resulting from the abandonment of grasslands and abandoned cultivated lands, forestry, different? And is this problematic? Could you answer to that? Yeah, actually, that is related to the grassland landscape in Aso region. I understand. I want to just show one slide. Here. Sorry, that is so in Japanese, but actually in Aso region, there are some type of the grassland. Then it's related to agriculture way. Then the many type of grassland can keep biodiversity. But so as I told you already, the abandonment, the maintenance of grassland, then natural succession proceed. Then maybe we will lose the biodiversity of grassland, but that is turn into the different biodiversity than maybe in bush or forest landscape. Then maybe that is a yes, and the other was abandoned cultivated lands, forestry. How is that different? Does that answer the question? Yeah, sorry, maybe I didn't catch that. Yes, Stefan, I see you are smiling. Do you have something to add?
Try to just add a bit from my perspective.
Yes.
We have managed forests, we have managed grasslands, and we have arable land. And all these areas in the more rural parts of Japan have now a tendency for being abandoned, for that the way they have been managed so far is discontinued. And that, as Tomohiro mentioned, the natural vegetation in most of Japan and Germany would be forest. If humans would not interfere, most would be forest covered. And therefore you could imagine that for forests, it wouldn't really matter that much if they're being abandoned, if they're not managed anymore. but that is also not necessarily the case. And where we have coppice forests and where you have maybe 20-year cycles where then trees are cut again. And so you have a particular structure of the forest, and that a lot of light comes down to the forest floor, and that can lead to higher biodiversity on the forest floor, things like that. So I would say there are not necessarily fundamental differences in terms of biodiversity effects between abandonment of traditionally managed forests, arable lands, and grasslands. But abandonment in all these cases can lead to species loss, because they are cultural landscapes, and the way that we use them have used them over the past centuries has created a particular way of or type of biodiversity that is there.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, I think we are learning that it's really extremely important to look at the specific area, and you cannot really generalize between all these trends and areas. So we always have to be very concrete if we are talking about these examples of biodiversity. Now, looking at the time, we have only 5 minutes left. So I would like to come to the topic of German-Japanese collaboration. We have already looked at some examples of German-Japanese collaboration, but what would you say are the strengths of Germany and Japan in this area of biodiversity research? If you could maybe just name a few. Julia, can we start with you?
Yeah, sure. I think that, you know, as I mentioned, both Germany and Japan are leaders in terms of infrastructure that we need to access the deep sea, but also two countries that have a strong tradition of valuing fundamental research. And in terms of being able to tackle the huge question of biodiversity, that is understanding how many species there are, this depends on fundamental research to discover and describe and name new species. And this type of research is you know, something that requires time and a lot of expertise and investment, and something that is still happily valued both in Germany and in Japan. And this is very much to our advantage. And I would add just one other thing, which is that I hope both Germany and Japan will emerge in the next, you know, in the coming decade of this, both as countries that drive a lot of technology innovation, that the number one thing that we can do to preserve especially deep sea ecosystems is to focus on avoiding the motivation for deep sea mining, which is to say that deep sea mining is motivated by the need for rare earth minerals that are components for electronics. Obviously, there are many German companies and many Japanese companies that are great innovators and great manufacturers of modern technologies and modern electronic devices. And there really needs to be a pressure to develop these technologies in a way that allows recycling of components, so that the need for extractive industries and developing continuous destruction is lessened, that we can just reuse and upcycle what's already existing, or, you know, what's being manufactured now.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. We actually didn't have much time today to talk about deep sea mining, which is a major risk actually also to the scalyfoot snail and other mollusks at the deep sea. But yeah, thank you very much for sharing that statement. And for all the viewers who are interested in that topic, I think you can find lots of information in the internet about that. Now next, Tomohiro, may I ask you about a Japanese-German collaboration? Where are our strengths, or is there something we can learn from each other? Could you share some of your insights from your experience? Oh, could you please unmute yourself? Your mic is still muted.
Yes. Yeah, as Julia already said, but since Japan and Germany are both technologically advanced countries, then maybe, yeah, we could innovate by collaborating, develop new biodiversity monitoring, as I said already, and also, yeah, conservation method, I think. And also, yeah, since both countries are economic powerhouses, then we expect to be able to make a global contribution by involving the private sector.
Yes, very important. Thank you for pointing that out. Now, Stefan, do you have something to add? Where can we collaborate? You have experience in both countries. Could you share your insights with us?
Yeah, I would certainly echo what Tomohiro and what Julia have said, that there are lots of opportunities for very promising collaboration between partners in Japan and in Germany, and that the academic sectors are large in both countries. We have lots of universities, lots of research institutes, and very well-established collaboration structures already. But we shouldn't take them for granted. There's often, certain risks, often funding, although we live in comparatively rich countries and are very, very well equipped with lots of tools and technology that we can apply compared to other countries, for example. But there's always the risk that this is not done at the right level in order to reach this critical level. Because what we need, obviously, is information that is also up to date and is available at different levels for to inform decision making in the private sector as well as in the public sector. And so that is, I guess, where the challenges are ahead, and where I think that biodiversity research, in particular in connection with information processing, information technology, can really help us a lot. To just have the information available when we need it and at the place where we need it.
Thank you very much. I think it's definitely a topic we will pick up again at the DWIH Tokyo as well, be it during our AI symposium or another coffee talk in the future. We still have some unanswered questions, but I'm sorry, time is up now, so we have to come to an end. But I would like to thank you very much for being with us today. And maybe we can raise our coffee talk cups and have a kampai. Thank you also to everyone who made time to watch this coffee talk. You can always revisit this talk later by watching our video or listening to the podcast. And please check out the DWIH website and subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you to our speakers, and see you next time. Kampai, cheers,
Thank you.
Prost.
Kampai.
Besten Dank.